Thank you, Sherwin. When I was an undergraduate, I took a class in early Jewish history, and my professor, Ivan Marcus, referred to what Yehuda Bauer called last night the lachrymose, the teary view of Jewish history, except he called it the oy vey view of Jewish history. We were in one place, and oy vey, they attacked us, and we had to move, and then we moved somewhere else, and oy vey, it was terrible there, and then that's the oy vey, or the lachrymose view of Jewish history, first lampooned by Professor Sala Baron at Columbia. But of course, the reality is that it's mixed. It's not the oy vey view of Jewish history, and it's not the oh boy view of Jewish history that everything was great. In fact, it's somewhere in the middle. And that too is the case for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a word that covers a broad spectrum, again, as Professor Bauer outlined last night. Imagine the spectrum during the Second World War from Italians who may not have liked Jews that much but saved them in large numbers, French non-Jews who saved their own Jews, whom they considered native French Jews, but not necessarily the Eastern Jews, the immigrant Jews, people in Poland who often would turn Jews over to the Nazis, but many saved Jews at the risk of their own life, where it was a capital crime in Poland to save a Jew, and the Ukraine, where many of the people there volunteer to work as guards or even as killers in the death camps and the special actions. This is a wide spectrum of behavior, and it's all covered in one broad stroke. When I graduated college, I came home, and one of the first events I came to here at the Temple was Colloquium 97, Reclaiming Jewish History. And at that colloquium, there was a scholar from Indiana University, of whom I had never heard, who came here and spoke about Zionism. And he spoke about it in a way and with ideas that I found really almost revelatory. If I weren't a humanist, they would have been revelatory. But in this case, they were very inspiring because they were a new way of looking at the state of Israel, of the issues of Zionism, and of the future of Zionism and how it would develop in the years to come. This professor is Derek Penslar, and he is here this morning to offer us his thoughts on the story of anti-Semitism. He is currently the director of the University of Toronto's Jewish Studies program. He told me that he will be the chief writer of the Oxford History of European Jewry from 1918 to the present, and he has been an editor of many volumes. You can see them listed in your program if you choose. It is my pleasure to welcome to this podium to offer us his story of anti-Semitism, Professor Derek Penslar.
Story of my life at Jewish gatherings. Just too tall. There we go. See, the microphone won't even. Okay, I'll have to stoop down. My wife is 4'11", so I'm used to it. I've been given the rather daunting task this morning of describing the history of anti-Semitism. Professor Bauer had a similar wide charge last night. And I want to begin really by talking not just about the story of anti-Semitism, but the story of the story. How do we even think about telling the story of anti-Semitism? Because this is actually going to be the main theme of my talk, is how do we frame the understanding of anti-Semitism within broader questions about Jewish history, the relations between Jews and Gentiles, and the way that Jews perceive themselves. It is difficult to approach the history of anti-Semitism because the subject is highly resistant to rational inquiry. It is so protean, it is so self-contradictory, it is so staggeringly diverse that one is tempted to simply chronicle it or decry it, condemn it, but not actually carefully study it. There's also the problem that anti-Semitism corrupts. It corrupts the minds of those who are seduced by it, but it can also distort the thinking of those who are victimized by it. And by that I mean that both the anti-Semite and the Jew, as it were, create monolithic views of the world. The anti-Semite portrays the world as controlled by Jews, the eternal Jew, the eternal Jewish conspiracy, and so forth. But there's been the problem that I've certainly noticed in my own work in the field of Jewish studies now for 20 years, that just as there is the eternal Jew in the anti-Semitic imagination, one runs the risk in the Jewish community of creating the mythological construct of the eternal anti-Semite. and of anti-Semitism as being hardwired into Christian or Muslim civilization and ineradicable. Now, the way people feel about this issue certainly varies depending on their own background. So, for example, I'm now in Toronto, which has the largest concentration of Holocaust survivors outside of the state of Israel in terms of per capita or per Jewish capita, as it were, population. Obviously, that's going to affect the way people think about the past, quite understandably. It'll be somewhat different in San Francisco or Boston or the like. So I suggest that we not approach the study of anti-Semitism in this sort of monolithic fashion. We've already been introduced into this way of thinking, or encouragement to think more broadly last night. And so rather than simply dismiss the way anti-Semites think as a waste of time, a dangerous legitimization of the anti-Semitic enterprise, to take the argument seriously, we do need to do so. We need to reconstruct their inner logic. We need to probe the rhetorical texture of anti-Semitism. We need to try to figure out what makes the anti-Semite tick. We need to avoid the temptation to avoid unpacking an anti-Semitic text. Who wants to unpack a bag full of filth? And yet that's exactly what we have to do when we study anti-Semitism. Just as the successful cure of a disease depends on knowledge of its physiological origins, so does an effective response to a social ill require a sound understanding of its causes. Among the popular imagination, anti-Semitism is often misunderstood as a syndrome, that is, a multiplicity of symptoms with a single underlying pathology. But I think on anti-Semitism on closer examination is something rather different. It is a symptom which can admit to a variety of causes. So thinking of anti-Semitism as a symptom rather than a syndrome, I think, is a useful medical analogy. Now, to continue for just a moment about the story of the story, before I get to the story. We have here a panel of distinguished scholars, theologians, journalists, who are going to try to tackle the whole issue of Jewish-non-Jewish relations, of which anti-Semitism is a part. And what's interesting to me is how academics in my own world of the university environment have ducked the issue, particularly in recent decades. In the 1950s and 60s, really until the 1970s, it seems to me that there was a motivation on the part of academics to study anti-Semitism seriously within a framework of a liberal post-World War II American environment in which anti-Semitism, anti-black sentiment, and so on were seen to be flaws, but ameliorable flaws in the liberal order. And there was a whole sociological literature on what at that time was called prejudice. That's the term that was used a lot in 1950s and 60s sociology. Prejudice, prejudgments which can be corrected through ameliorative action. There was a sea change in academia in the 1970s as the result of the civil rights movement, as the result of feminism, as the result of Israel's victory in the 1967 war, which promoted a good deal of anti-Israel sentiment, also as a result of Jewish socioeconomic mobility, in which Jews very clearly appeared to distance themselves from any serious discrimination that had been directed against them earlier. And even the word prejudice begins to disappear from the sociological lexicon. It's replaced by a new word, racism. See courses on the history of racism. Now, Jews are white. And I don't mean just in terms of pigmentation. I mean in terms of socioeconomic status and position in American society in the post-war order. And you see less and less of an emphasis on a generalized prejudice in which Jews are victims along with lots of other people, more of a focus on race and racism. And the Jews get separated from the equation. Now, until a few years ago, that wasn't so much of an issue because, frankly, the Jews were doing very well in North America. But as we all know, in the last 3 years, there have been changes, largely as the result of events related to the Middle East, whether it be the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Israeli reoccupation of the West Bank and Gaza, well, not yet Gaza, but probably soon to come, and also, of course, the World Trade Center destruction in September of 2001. A variety of events related to the Middle East seem to have now stoked new waves of anti-Jewish feeling, not just in North America, but in places as far-flung as Los Angeles and London, Marseille, and Mombasa. Now, what's interesting to me is that few of my colleagues outside of the field of Jewish studies are really taking this on, that anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that must be carefully investigated. Instead, what I run into in the academy is the notion that anti-Semitism is still a rather marginal phenomenon that pales in comparison with racism and misogyny, and anti-Jewish hate crimes, although deeply regrettable, are peripheral. They're conceived of as manifestations of unresolved ethnic conflicts. That's how people in my field normally talk about what's going on in France today. Or it is somehow spillover from the Arab-Israeli conflict, or it's related to globalism or anti-globalism protests and so forth. In other words, I think that academics are dodging the bullet. I think my colleagues, and I'm not saying this as an alarmist, because I'm not, as you'll hear from the heart of my remarks. I think anti-Semitism has to be carefully probed, studied, interrogated, and it has to be carefully framed in a historical context. Historical analysis is an essential tool because, consciously or not, we're all historians. We all carry collective memory with us. We all carry the family memory, the school-induced memories, and so on. And they do inform the way we think about anti-Semitism and what it's like to be a Jew in a non-Jewish world. Framing and perspective in politics, as in art, are inextricably linked. So if, for example, in our collective memory, anti-Semitism is viewed as eternal and fundamentally unchanging, then attitudes towards the present situation will be far different than if we think of anti-Semitism as constantly in flux. The question of how we respond to anti-Semitism, fatalism, passivity, activism, what sort of activism, depends on how we view anti-Semitism in the framework of history as a whole. So I'm asking then for a serious academic study of anti-Semitism. I'm asking for one that is responsible and not alarmist. And I'm asking for one that takes into account history, not for the sake of understanding history, but because it's an essential tool for perceiving the uniqueness and the continuity between what's happening now and the past. So I'm going to speak for a while now about framing, using certain select examples from history to show how the way we think about Jewish-Gentile relations over thousands of years directly affects the way we think about the present. I'm going to go back to something that Professor Bauer mentioned last night, the happy city of Alexandria in 38 CE. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, with a major Jewish community, was engulfed by anti-Jewish riots, fueled by Egyptian resentment against Roman rule and the favorable political status of Jews in the city. Some of the Roman Empire's greatest figures, Cicero, Tacitus, Juvenal, decried Judaism as a superstitious and intolerant religion and Jews as clannish and disloyal. Were these expressions anti-Semitic? Meaning, let's define the term, motivated by an irrational and yet coherently structured matrix of anti-Jewish sentiment? If so, were they representative about Gentile feelings about Jews in pagan antiquity, or were they exceptions? Because if you simply look at texts and texts alone, you can always find proof of anti-Semitism, whether it is in Alexandrian antiquity or whether it is in any period in history. I'll give more examples how anti-Jewish rhetoric alone doesn't really tell us very much. Text is not important compared with context. I'm going to jump up to the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE. Now, when I was in university, I was taught all about the discriminatory legislation leveled against the Jews in the late Roman Empire. And indeed, such legislation did occur. A picture of Jewish life in early Christendom derived from these texts alone would be grim. And yet, throughout the early centuries of Christianity, close social contacts between Jews and Gentiles continued, much to the consternation of the Church Fathers, whose vicious diatribes against the Jews were, at least in part, the product of frustration that Christians were continuing to socialize with them, were attending their synagogues, were visiting their homes. In certain times and places, such as the Empire of Charlemagne, Jews enjoyed greater economic and legal liberties than many Christians. And you encounter a similar complex story regarding Islam. On the one hand, the foundational texts of Islam are replete with anti-Jewish imagery. And there's no sense, as some Muslim apologists try to do, covering it up. On the other hand, Jews flourished in medieval Islam as nowhere else since the heyday of pagan antiquity. Now, as is well known, in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, Jews in Europe had it rough. They were frequently the targets of mob justice, government-sponsored torture and execution, and expulsion. So here one thinks, this was when the Jews really had it bad. We can take some sort of solace. We say, this is anti-Semitism, pure and simple. The Jews are singled out. And here we can draw some kind of connection, anti-Semitism across time and space. But even this gets complicated. It relates to the issue of framing. And I'd like to refer you to a remarkable book by a historian named David Nirenberg, who now teaches at Johns Hopkins, as he's observed in a recent study of Jewish life in medieval Christian Spain. Much mob action against Jews most often took the form of restrained and ritualized displays of superiority, the shouting of epithets, the throwing of stones, the doors to Jewish homes. Certain times, certain occasions, the rituals were no longer able to suffice, and the violence became lethal. And what was interesting to him is how and why it happened, that the violence would become lethal. I do not wish to minimize the extent of the anti-Jewish feeling in the Middle Ages, but in an environment suffused with group hatreds, blood feuds, and honor killings, the position of Jews was not necessarily more precarious than that of many others. I'll provide another example from early modern Germany, another new book I was just reading about the social status of outsider groups in early modern Germany. Jews were one of many groups considered dishonorable, groups that included not only pariahs like gypsies, vagrants, and prostitutes, but also skilled tradesmen like executioners and skinners. Interestingly enough, both executioners and Jews in early modern Germany were considered to possess occult medical knowledge, the former because of their intimate knowledge of the suffering body, the latter because of alleged magical powers, which I suspect may derive from the primal execution, that of Jesus. Both Jews and executioners, by the way, also enjoyed exemptions. Executioners didn't have to pay tax. I guess they'd already paid the head tax. Sorry. And Jews did not have to serve in the military. Another example. In the early modern civilization of Poland and Lithuania, which we heard about last night, there was actually quite a bit of Catholic and church-sponsored anti-Semitism, as a new book by Magdalena Teeter has shown. But nonetheless, Jews experienced considerable freedom of movement and occupation. Even in the 19th century Russian Empire, now we're getting very close to home, because I imagine that many of you are, your parents or grandparents or whatever were from Russia, from Imperial Russia, early Soviet Russia, where there was clearly state-sponsored anti-Semitism, numerous bloody pogroms in the late 19th, early 20th century. Even here, Jews were in virtually every way better off than most Russians, because they weren't serfs. The historic status of the Jews in Europe throughout history was that of free men. Freedom of movement, with certain exceptions, much more than the peasantry that was often bound to the land. Until rather late in the Middle Ages, Jews had the right to bear arms, for example, which we're not often aware of. Now, this comparative approach that I'm suggesting towards the study of anti-Semitism would appear to pale and simply become altogether inappropriate if we approach the Holocaust. Because here we're dealing with the greatest single, not just the greatest single tragedy in the history of the Jews. We're dealing with the single greatest act of inhumanity that civilization's been able to produce. And yet, I do think the comparative approach is useful, partly in that it explains the common forces that made modern genocide possible, but it highlights the uniqueness of the Holocaust. So there's nothing wrong with talking about the Holocaust in context. But more relevant to the purview of our conference is the necessity never to conceive of Jewish history in a teleological fashion. Never to conceive that it was marching right from the beginning, from Alexandria through the Middle Ages, through the pogroms in Russia, all the way up to the Holocaust, as if it could have produced no other end. I would rather stress the contingent qualities of historical change. There are broad socioeconomic and political forces that help structure history, historical development, and yet it is never beholden to such structures. History has many futures, and I think that this actually helps us appreciate the true magnitude of the Holocaust. What is truly horrific is that it didn't have to happen. Auschwitz did not have to be built. I find that infinitely worse than thinking about the Holocaust as a teleological outcome of anti-Semitism rooted in civilization. Now, the Nazis' murderous anti-Semitism had little to do with real Jews. It was a mixture of irrational phobias and fantasies. The Nazis drew upon both traditional Christian Jew hatred and modern political anti-Semitism. The term anti-Semitism, which emerged in the 1880s, presented Jew hatred as a systematic ideology, an ism, to compete with the other great ideological systems of the time, liberalism and socialism. Political anti-Semitism identified the Jew as responsible for all of the anxiety-provoking forces that characterize modernity: ruthless capitalism, revolutionary communism, and avant-garde artistic modernism. Now, Jews were not the cause of any of these, but Jews were disproportionately involved in them because Jews were an urbanized, educated people, and so they tended to be disproportionately involved in both the development of capitalism and the development of revolutionary politics. And there is, therefore, a certain logic to anti-Semitism. And I want to make very clear, I'm not justifying it, there is a certain logic. Anti-Semitism accuses Jews of certain things but not others. The anti-Semite's Jew has a certain coherent form. The anti-Semite's Jew is not stupid. He is not brutish. He is not enslaved to passion. The anti-Semite's Jew possesses only selected attributes of the human psyche, such as arrogance, cupidity, and a thirst for power. And I think this is very important because if we look at the history of racism, which George Fredrickson has pointed out in a wonderful recent book on racism, there are differences between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Anti-black feeling in the United States tends to stress the obsessive paranoid fear of the mass, whereas the Jew is the cabal, the conspirator. Anti-black racism has the notion of the black as anti-modern, irrational, whereas the anti-Semite perceives the Jew as hyper-rational and hyper-modern. Now, I'm not saying that one form of racism is less dangerous than the other, but I'm saying that they're different. And they're different because they do respond in one way or another to social reality. The Jews have been a small minority throughout history. They've been a mercantile minority. They've been an urban minority. They've been heavily, disproportionately represented in fields of academic inquiry, in political revolution, in certain fields of economic innovation, and so on. This is reality. It doesn't justify the anti-Semitism, but it feeds, at least, the image that is created. And by the way, I mentioned this because I've had a recent interesting exchange with an Arab student of mine who, following Edward Said, believes that anti-Semitism and contemporary anti-Arab and anti-Muslim feeling are closely related. I would much rather conceive of anti-Muslim and anti-Arab feeling more within the framework of 19th century and 20th century American anti-black racism, or perhaps anti-Asian racism, like the notion of the yellow peril that was so common in the early 20th century. This is not saying any of these forms of racism are pretty. It's just trying to explain where anti-Semitism fits into a broader continuum. Now, modern anti-Semitism was more than just an expression of bigotry or prejudice. It was, as one historian has put it so succinctly, a cultural code, a signifier of social protest by individuals who were simply unable or unwilling to confront the bewildering challenges posed by modernity. There are certainly some lines of continuity between classic European anti-Semitism and what the world seems to be experiencing today, and I'll leave it to my colleague Todd Endelman to go into more detail about that issue later. The fact is that in North America and Europe today, although there is anti-Semitism, it is not state-sanctioned, it is not state-sponsored, it is for the most part socially unacceptable. And the fact is that Jews today do have a much easier situation than they had in, let's say, even the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. But there is an entirely new issue when we speak about the need to frame anti-Semitism, to present it in context, that exists today that never existed before in the long, long history of anti-Semitism since the time of the Middle Ages. And that's, of course, Israel. There is an empowered Jewish state in the Middle East. This does change the equation. It's a sensitive issue, and it's one that we have to deal with, again, head-on, using historical analysis to elucidate contemporary trends. And once again, I'm going to use a medical analogy. I guess I'm hanging out too much with doctors these days. I would say that anti-Semitism in Europe and North America historically was akin to a psychosomatic illness. Whereas in the Arab world over the last century, anti-Semitism has more closely resembled a toxic allergic reaction. The former originates in fantasy and yet cripples the body politic. The latter is a debilitating, even fatal response to a genuine substance. I'm going to approach this subject in a very unusual way. There's a lot of public discourse now about Arab anti-Semitism, Arab attitudes towards Israel, and so forth, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of my remarks. But I want to introduce a new factor. Let's look at how European anti-Semites have viewed Zionism and Israel. And then we can look for comparisons and see how different the classic European anti-Semitic worldview is from what is going on in the Arab world today. Because European anti-Semitism never knew what to do with Zionism. It did not exist as a discrete phenomenon in the anti-Semitic imagination. Anti-Semitic ideologues tended to ignore Zionism, or they dismissed it as a means of distracting attention from the alleged Jewish international conspiracy, or as an integral part of that conspiracy. And I've been doing research on the subject, reading the writings of anti-Semitic journalists. Again, not a pleasant activity. Edouard Drumont, perhaps the most famous late 19th century French anti-Semite, wrote hundreds, thousands of articles about the Jews, rarely dealt with anti-Semitism. And when he did, at first he supported it because he thought it would get the Jews out of Europe. And then he turned against it because he assumed that because the world is controlled by assimilated Jewish bankers, they will prevent Zionism from realizing its goals. He simply decided that without any real engagement with anything that was happening in the Jewish world. Even more so in Germany, where German anti-Semites from the start dismissed anti-Semitism as a trick. The best example of this comes from the most unpleasant human being in late 19th century Germany who wrote on the subject of the Jews, Eugen Döring, who wrote a brutally anti-Semitic book that went through lots of editions all the way up to 1930. So he could have dealt with Zionism in some sort of systematic way. He tended to dismiss it in a few sentences as simply impossible to be realized because the Jews are incorrigible. So he wrote, they're disposed to parasitism and nomadism. And so in one interesting sentence, he writes that the Jews will always prefer living under the most oppressive conditions among Gentiles than among their own kind, whom they would find it difficult to exploit. He wrote that a Jewish state would only accentuate Jewish power. The Jewish snake that encircles the globe would now have a head. And as he wrote in the last edition of his book before his death, 1930, he wrote, if the Jewish state were to be established, we would make necessary something like a second Roman clearing action. It would mean going back to the beginning where the matter would be brought to an end in an entirely different and far more comprehensive sense. A very, very chilling foreshadowing of the Holocaust, and yet a casual sentence in a 300-page book about the Jews. Zionism is simply not acknowledged. Like ultraviolet light, invisible to the naked eye, the Zionist project simply could not be perceived within the optical field of European anti-Semitism. For anti-Semites, Zionism was nothing but smoke and mirrors. The only response was to conjure it away. The notion that Zionism was nothing but another form of Jewish criminality was central to Nazism. You see it in Alvin Rosenberg's claim in 1922 that Zionism was an anti-German movement that drew support from reactionary Jewish capitalists and communists alike. Adolf Hitler then picked this up, writing in Mein Kampf that a Jewish state would become, I'm quoting from Mein Kampf, a haven for convicted scoundrels and a university for budding crooks. By the way, Canada has been bedeviled by the notorious Holocaust denier Zundel, who has characterized Israel as, quote, a gangster enclave in the Middle East. And I think that we're seeing the pedigree of that statement. But even in Nazi ideology, Zionism was little more than an addendum to a well-worn diatribe against international Jewish political machinations and inveterate malevolence. The presence of the Zionist movement doesn't really affect the way anti-Semites think about the world. And I'll make one final reference here, one final example to demonstrate my point, which is the most notorious anti-Semitic tract ever written, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. There's a footnote in the interwar editions of the Protocols, little note right at the very beginning, says, these are the deliberations from the First Zionist Congress, and it was found in Theodor Herzl's study. If you read the Protocols, there's nothing in the Protocols that has anything to do with Zionism, and no edition of the Protocols produced has any reference to Zionism. Even Henry Ford, the land of Henry Ford, even Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent which produced a kind of a paraphrase of the protocols, slightly altered for an American audience. Even there's some reference to the Zionist congresses. The text of the protocols has nothing to do with Zionism. Zionism, in sum, did not exist as a discrete phenomenon in the minds of European anti-Semites before the Holocaust. It was a placeholder and nothing more for a host of conspiratorial fantasies rooted deep in the 19th century. So this is the way that traditional anti-Semitism conceives of Zionism. And well, I think when we get to the Arab world, it's different. Simply put, whereas European anti-Semites regarded Zionism as a manifestation of Judaism, in the Middle East, Jews and Judaism have, for the past century, been defined in terms of Zionism. As Yehoshaphat Harkabi wrote back in 1978, great scholar of, Israeli scholar of the Arab world, he wrote that Arab anti-Semitism was the product of a specific political conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, less than Islamic religious traditions or inveterate Muslim intolerance towards Jews. And Harkabi knew what he was talking about. He'd written a major work about Arab attitudes towards Israel. He was not trying to hide, conceal Arab animosity towards Israel. Harkabi also noted that Arab anti-Semitism is fluid, goes up and down. For example, in the Egyptian press, there'd be a lot of anti-Semitism in the Nasserite period, and then in the era of Camp David, it declines. Now, like Harkabi, I'm very, very concerned about an opposite point of view where one says, okay, Arab anti-Semitism is different from Christian anti-Semitism, and one goes so far as to deny or minimize the presence of an anti-Jewish streak, right? Very powerful anti-Jewish streak in the history of Islam, and particularly the Middle East. The fact is that the fate of Jews in the Islamic world was often an unhappy one. There's no point denying it. And as I mentioned earlier, the foundational texts of Islam do contain a great many anti-Jewish statements. You don't simply look at the Quran, you look at the Hadith literature, you look at the authorized biographies of Muhammad and so on, you find the most horrific things. The Jews poisoned Muhammad. Jews are responsible for Shiism, by the way, in some traditional Islamic sources. Everything is blamed on the Jews, right? The Shiite-Sunni split, because Islam simply means Shi is faction, right? Like Siyah, the word Siyah in Hebrew, which refers to a faction. So clearly we have this anti-Jewish textual tradition, and yet in context, to get back to the prevalence of context over text, the life of Jews in the Islamic world until very recently was far better than it was in Christendom. I have a colleague who will remain nameless who, when I was talking about this matter, said, but what about Maimonides' letter to the Jews of Yemen? This is a letter that Maimonides, the great Jewish halakhic authority and philosopher, wrote in 1172, in which Maimonides wrote that the lot of Jews in Islam is much worse than under Christian rule. He says, look, Maimonides said it. It must be true. This was a cri de coeur at a time when the Jews in North Africa were undergoing extreme and very rare persecution. So Maimonides wrote as a child of his time, as we all do. It is not a programmatic statement. Now, what's interesting then is how anti-Semitism proper, real live anti-Semitism of the European sort, filters into the Middle East. It comes in the 19th century via French and Francophone Christian clerics, but during the late Ottoman period, Arab opposition to Zionism was not necessarily anti-Semitic. If you look at some of the writings of the founders of Arab nationalism, they express a fear that Palestinian Arabs are going to be uprooted by Jewish immigration. The Muslim reformer Rashid Rida believed Jews to comprise a unified and powerful collective, so you might say, oh, it's anti-Semitic. But his main concern in his writings was the reality presented by the Jewish immigration into Palestine. Not, as in Europe, broad social transformations in which Jews played no real role. The secular Arab nationalist Najib Azuri, who wrote a classic work in 1905 called Le Réveil de la Nation Arabe, The Awakening of the Arab Nation, described Jews quite realistically as a people engaged in a concerted drive to establish a state in what they perceived to be their homeland. And the development of anti-Semitism proper in connection with Zionism seems to really occur after World War I, when the, boy, that's sort of like a baby's cry. You can't ignore that one. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion first appeared in the Arabic language in 1925 during the fourth and largest yet wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine. The translation from the French was the work of a Catholic priest in Egypt. The following year, 1926, an article in a periodical of the Jerusalem Latin Patriarchate announced the presence of the Arabic translation of the Protocols and urged the faithful to read them in order to understand what the Zionists had in store for Palestine. In 1928 and 1929, the Palestinian religious and political leader, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, publicized portions of the Protocols. So what happens is we have a Christian means of transmission of the Protocols, which is then used by Muslims, but in response to a political issue, which is the Zionist-Arab conflict. And then you begin to see in the interwar period the development of a real, live, conspiratorial anti-Semitism, where Jews are blamed for everything. So, for example, royalist Arabs blame the Jews for communism because Jews are overrepresented in the Egyptian and Iraqi communist parties, whereas leftists blame the Jews for propping up the colonialist right-wing authoritarian regimes because Jews were purveyors to and very important in the court, let's say, of King Farouk of Egypt, which is also true. Because again, there is this truth about the urban, mercantile, highly effervescent intellectual and economic qualities of Jews. So what we begin to see in the 1930s and 1940s is real live European-style anti-Semitism in which the Jew is associated with chaos, the Jew as universal solvent, the Jew as destroyer of social order. Even the notion of the Jew as having preternatural sexual powers, which is a classic in European anti-Semitism, gets exported to the Middle East in the accusation that the kibbutz women, who after all go around in shorts and they don't cover themselves in traditional Islamic modest fashion, notion that Jews were sexually promiscuous. Indeed, the Arab word for communist was ibahi, permissive. Interesting combination. Now, however, until 1948, Arab anti-Semitism did not routinely function, as it did in Europe, as a totally unbounded discourse, attributing every ill in modern humanity to Jewish influence. It was still tied very closely to Palestine. I'll give a final example at this point. There was a play written in 1920 in Nablus called The Ruin of Palestine, in which you have a beautiful daughter of a Jewish tavern keeper, stock motif, who seduces two Arab men. They give this woman the deeds to their land, and then they wail at the end, "My country is ruined. The Jews have robbed us of our land and honor," and then they kill themselves. It's the end of the play. Now, how does this help us understand the contemporary situation in the State of Israel? I think things have changed. Traditional Islam scorned the Jew. Contemporary anti-Semitism fears him. Traditional Muslim Judeophobia saw the Jew as weak and degraded. Contemporary Islam sees the Jew as having global power, as the Prime Minister of Malaysia's recent comments suggested. And this fear stems from the apparent inability of Arabs to stop what has seemed to them to be the Jewish takeover of Palestine, a land that has had great sanctity in the Muslim tradition. The ongoing contempt of Jews, or the ongoing contempt, has been expressed by the widespread view that, humiliating though it was to be subjected to Christian Europe, it's even worse to be subject to the rule of Jews. Now, Western pundits are fond of saying that Arab culture is an honor culture, and so if basically the presence of Israel or the American presence in the Middle East offends Arab sensibilities. I think there's something much deeper and much more important going on, which is that the discourse on dignity in the Middle East stems from a sense not just of wounded pride, but real helplessness. Because the loss of Palestine was a very important, tragic event in the Arab world. The term in 1956 coined by Konstantin Zaraik, the term al-Nakba, the catastrophe, the disaster, has gained universal currency in the Arab world ever since. And the fact is that al-Nakba really happened. Okay? Regardless of how you attribute responsibility for the 1948 war, or the 1967 war, or the occupation of the territories, or the settlement of Jews in the territories, or Israeli actions ever since, the fact is these things have really happened. There is an immeasurable gap between this scenario and that of modern Europe, where Jews as a collective wielded no power, conquered no land, never expelled anyone from their home. Now, there is a demonic Manichaean Arab anti-Semitism in the contemporary world, associated with radical Islam, as we heard last night, and we'll no doubt hear later from Yaakov Malkin, associated with the Muslim Brotherhood and the writings of Said Qutb, which sees the Jew as a malevolent force throughout history and so on. One finds this in all sorts of silly ways as well, in which Arabs accuse Israel of introducing AIDS into the Middle East, which has happened. In Saudi Arabia, I read 2 weeks ago, the government-sponsored Commission for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice branded the Barbie doll as, quote, a Jewish doll, promoting the lewd behavior of a perverted Western world. There is nonetheless still a Palestinian or Palestine-centric quality to Arab anti-Semitism. No doubt some of you were quite alarmed by the serialization on Egyptian television of a program recently called Horsemen Without a Horse, which was based in part on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I noticed something very interesting about that program, which is it speaks quite specifically of a Jewish conspiracy to take over Palestine. That's not in the protocols. Right? Protocols talk very vaguely about Jewish control of Europe and so on, because the protocols were forged by Russian reactionaries with a very specific agenda. In other words, the protocols get Palestinified, as it were. And the protocols come in and out of fashion. They were quite popular in Egypt under Nasser. They fell out of circulation under Camp David. They've returned now with the failure of Oslo, and so on. So there are, of course, different qualities of Arab anti-Semitism that have to be distinguished. Now, in August of this year, Muqtada al-Sadr Najaf, the most fanatical, and alas, the only surviving, claimant to the leadership of southern Iraq's Shi'i Muslims, proclaimed the American-installed coalition government in Baghdad to be Zionist. Now, what did he mean by that? Was he simply using the word Zionist as a blanket pejorative, as was the case in the old Soviet Union? Or was he really saying that there was a direct association between the American regime and Israeli interests? Is it possible, and this is my last major point, is it possible to separate the strands of anti-Americanism, hostility to Israel, and anti-Semitism in the modern Middle East, which is dominant, which is ancillary? Let's engage in a thought experiment. Let's imagine there's no Israel. Very easy to imagine. And I'm serious. Herzl could have become a successful playwright. He would never have turned to political theater. Chaim Weizmann's experiments with acetone may have failed, and he would never have become a confidant of the British War Cabinet. Germany may have won World War I, in which case the Ottoman Empire wouldn't have fallen apart quite so quickly. Saddam Hussein would have wound up as a conductor on the Baghdad Railway. In this world, yeah, there would have been eventually independence movements in the Arab world. There would have been a Palestinian national movement, by the way, because Palestinian national consciousness dates back to the late 19th century. But the Palestinian national movement would have been much weaker than that in Egypt or Syria, and probably Palestine would have been gobbled up by its neighbors. But there would have been eventually a Palestinian guerrilla nationalist movement, which would have created instability in the region, and perhaps even international intervention because of Jerusalem's sacredness to Christendom. The Western powers would be heavily involved not only in Palestine, but in the Middle East as a whole, due to oil interests. And the United States would be the world's most powerful country still in this scenario, and therefore heavily involved. In other words, if there were no Israel, there would still be anti-Western sentiment in the Middle East, there would still be anti-Americanism, Islamic fundamentalism would still flourish, the region would still be unstable. So that's without Israel. But would there be the same kind of anti-Semitism that we see in the Middle East today? Well, there would be anti-Semitism, that's for sure, because the Jew was associated with the West, with colonialism in Morocco, in Egypt, in Iraq, and so forth. Those connections would have still existed. You see fundamentalist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamic Jihad are wont to persecute minorities of all types. So, for example, Muslim fundamentalists in Egypt today will, from time to time, murder Copts. They're not supposed to. Coptic Christians are members of the protected Christian minority. They're not supposed to, but they get persecuted. So nonetheless, there would still be anti-Semitism in the Middle East, even without Israel. However, clearly, it would not be a fraction of what it is today, because it is being marshaled in the service of the Palestinian cause. So I think the thought experiment is very helpful, that what's going on in the Middle East today is a political conflict in which anti-Semitism is responding to a specific situation. Israel, unlike the Jewish global conspiracy of the European anti-Semitic imagination, really does exist. which is going to make the undoing of the current crisis both more challenging but also more possible. To quote Harkabi, it is not the change of images which will lead to peace, but peace which will lead to the change of images. This time around, anti-Semitism grows out of a political conflict in which Jews are empowered actors, not figments of the imagination. I'm not going to lie. I believe the chances for accommodation between Israel and the Arab world today are slim. But I do believe that the conditions are more favorable than they were, say, in pre-World War II Europe, precisely because of the realities that exist on the ground. And let me simply, by means of conclusion, go back to where I started, the question of framing. How do we think about the relationship between anti-Semitism in the past and anti-Semitism today? I have suggested discontinuity more than continuity. I have suggested context more than text. I'm urging us all to avoid the temptation that I have run into all too often, to operate under the feelings that change over time is not substantive, that the course of history resembles, if not a circle, then a geometric form known as a fractal. A fractal is, for those of you who haven't recently been in university math, a fractal, or high school math, since my son is my math tutor, it's a geometric form, any part of which recapitulates the fundamental structure of the whole. And according to this way of thinking, the contexts in which anti-Semitism has flourished over the ages don't matter. They're merely a superstructure built upon a base of Judeophobia that's been ingrained into Christian and Muslim civilization since their inception and lives on today. Now, of course, there are aspects of anti-Semitism that do have a very long half-life indeed. But I'm asking you to consider an alternative view, one that conceives of history as filled with ruptures as well as continuities, with quantum changes in perception and definition. Upon closer view, what Lord Acton called the seamless web of history resembles a vast jigsaw puzzle, a coherent whole composed of discrete shapes that are joined tightly together and yet each with its own distinct features. The travails experienced by Jews in the world of 2003 are grave, but they're not identical to those suffered in 1933 or 1648 or any other time in history. Anti-Semitism today represents a real threat to the well-being not only of Jews but also to the societies in which they live, and we must all work collectively to combat it. But I hope the battle will be conducted with awareness of the context in which the new anti-Semitism flourishes, sensitivity to the connections between anti-Semitism and other types of politicized hatred, a sage combination of instruments of persuasion and coercion, and a commitment to maintain the openness and flexibility of the civil society of the United States. Thank you.